Welcome everyone to our discussion on this dynamic between grace and works. Some people believe, lots of people believe that grace and works are mutually exclusive. However, the Bible has something different to say about that. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is talking about his ministry from a general standpoint, and he says, "But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace to me has not been in vain." And that last phrase I want to highlight, has not been in vain. What does that mean? That means that it is possible to receive God's grace, but for that grace to have no effect. And thankfully, the Apostle Paul goes on and he gives us a tip on how to receive God's grace in the positive way, such that the grace does have a positive effect. And he says here, I worked harder. Right? The grace of God comes to us, and if we don't work, well, guess what? It's in vain. Okay? It is absolutely and completely in vain. We have to receive God's grace, but then we have to get to work. It says here, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I. So now Paul, the Apostle Paul, is flip-flopping back and forth. At least that's what it looks like. But we have to understand that grace and work, it is a paradox. Okay? And the devil will use every paradox to confuse us and to try to sell us an idea of grace that is simply not correct. All right? One of the common concepts that people have about grace is that grace is the excuse to do nothing. Grace is the excuse not to have good works. If we're saved by grace, well then, we don't have to do anything. However, Paul is saying something very different from that. He's saying that if we just read the spirit of the text, it says here, if I didn't work, the grace would have had no effect. That's very important. And it says, not I, but the grace of God within me. So the grace of God comes to us, and we have to work with the grace of God for the grace of God to have its effect. If Paul had decided, you know what, I'm not interested in working, and I'm going to do nothing, well, guess what? The grace of God would have come to no effect. So the grace of God is the demand and also the empowerment to get to work. Now, the next verse is the same exact topic. It's the dynamic, the paradox of grace and works. Where before, Paul was talking about ministry work. Today, in this verse, he's talking about eternal salvation. So we better have this right. If we have a wrong concept of verse in our mind and in our heart, and we believe a false grace, well, guess what? We're not going to be saved, right? If the true grace is what gets us saved, it's the false grace that tells us that we're saved, but in reality, we're not. We want to make sure we get this right. We want to make sure that the grace does not come to us, but it's in vain. For by grace you are saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is a gift of God, and it is not from works, so that no one can boast. Now, some people, they stop right there. They say the gospel is verse 8 and 9, and boom, we're done. However, the Apostle Paul keeps going, right? He continues on in verse 10. He has not stopped the topic of eternal salvation. He continues in verse 10, right? Now, we have to make sure we understand that what Paul has said in verses 8 and 9 is that we cannot go to God and buy our grace. The grace of God is a gift, right? God will be boasting, but we will not be boasting. However, he continues to talk about this dynamic between grace and work, just like he did about the ministry. He continues on this dynamic between grace and work in terms of eternal salvation. It says here, for we are his creative work. Now, this is God doing, right? I've got that in green. God is doing the creative work, having been created in Christ Jesus. So God, again, is doing the creating. Okay, that is his work, not our work. For a good work. Keep in mind, pay very close attention. Birds, right? They were created to fly. The fish, they were created to swim. And we humans, we were created to do good work. For a good work that God prepared beforehand. Now, in the spirit of this text, it sounds like before the foundations of the world. So we were created to do good work, but God knows that we cannot do good work on our own accord. We need God's grace. See, God gives us his grace so that we can do good work, so we can do them. Grace is not an excuse to do nothing. Grace is not an excuse not to do good works. See, Paul, the same issues we have today, the same false grace that we have running around today is the same false grace that Paul dealt with, and the same false grace that the prophets in the Old Testament, for example, Jeremiah, dealt with. Okay, this idea that grace allows me to do nothing because I'm saved by grace and not by works, that means I do no work. No, that's not what he's saying here, right? Because I cannot go to work and buy my grace, that doesn't mean I don't do work, right? God's grace, as we read here, the spirit of the text, is God's demand and God's power to do good works. And so this idea is flipped on its head that we can go to God and buy God's grace. It's actually the opposite. God comes to us with grace, and he's buying, to a certain extent, he's buying good works from us. He is expecting that when God gives us his grace, that he gets a return on his investment. And we have some verses in Matthew 24, Matthew 25, around that framework. It goes very clearly that God says he gives you something, and he's going to come back and he's going to come looking for a return on his investment. And if he doesn't see a return on his investment, well, guess what? You're not a part of his kingdom. That's what it means. So again, we want to make sure that we understand grace and works. Grace and works are not mutually exclusive. Actually, they are intimately tied together. If we have received God's grace, we're working. If we're not working, that means we haven't received God's grace, or we haven't received God's grace and had its effect. And so God's grace, again, is God's demand, as we see in verse 10, and also his empowerment, that's also in verse 10, to do good works.